The mud streets of Chicago in 1836 did not look like the epicenter of a global financial empire. But to the men trading pieces of paper in crowded taverns, they might as well have been paved with gold. A plot of swampland that had sold for a few $100s the year prior was suddenly changing hands for $11,000. You didn't need gold to buy it. You didn't even need silver. You just needed paper. Crisp, newly printed notes from localized pet banks that had sprung up across the frontier like weeds. The United States was expanding westward, and the public was absolutely intoxicated by the illusion of infinite prosperity. The everyday American believed that they had cracked the code to wealth, which was to buy land on credit, wait a week, and then turn around and sell it for double. But true wealth is not created by printing paper. It is created by the brutal, mathematical transfer of hard assets from the uninformed many to the orchestrated few. Welcome to the 18-year real estate cycle. To truly see the cosmic map of how markets are pumped, fractured, bled, and ultimately consolidated, we have to look at one of the grandfathers of American financial slaughter. The Panic of 1837 and the agonizing 6-year march to the bottom in 1843. Before we look at the specific years, you must understand the heartbeat of this entire mechanism. It never changes. Every 18 years, when the real estate market reaches maximum, blinding euphoria, Jupiter forms a violent, hard angle to the nation's natal nodes. When Jupiter hits the nodes, the balloon becomes fully inflated. We reach the top. We sink to the bottom. When Jupiter retreats from a trine or a sextile, a 60-degree or a 120-degree aspect, to the nodal axis, or comes into a conjunction with one of the nodes, we tend to reach a bottom after the market turns. You are going to see how this heartbeat has perfectly dictated the obliteration of the United States housing market starting in 1837. And pay close attention, because a similar, almost identical planetary picture is painting itself in the stars in 2026. The foundation of every catastrophic crash is a period of unregulated euphoric expansion. In the mid-1830s, President Andrew Jackson had dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, transferring federal funds to state-level pet banks. These were said to be unshackled from federal oversight. These local banks began printing what we call wildcat currency, and they were doing so at an astonishing rate. They were lending it to anyone with a pulse to speculate on Western lands. The powers that be needed the frontier built, but they didn't want to take the risk. According to economic historian Peter Temin, in his definitive work, The Jacksonian Economy, the total U.S. money supply was allowed to inflate from 109 million in 1830 to 276 million by 1837. That's an astonishing 153% increase. This wildcat printing was funding the back-breaking labor of building the early American canal and the early railroad infrastructure. Once the physical assets were built, the larger banks could simply pull the liquidity. They could collapse the paper and repossess the hard assets. And that's the exact definition of this hypersupply phase. The public gorges on the paper illusion. When big banks or unregulated pet banks expand the money supply, then the purchasing power of that paper drops. Property itself serves as a hedge, absorbing that excess liquidity and causing nominal prices to soar. We are seeing this exact regional mirage right now in 2026 in the Sun Belt. In areas like Florida and Austin, developers, over-leveraged, just like pet banks in 1836, they hit hypersupply early, leaving a ton of inventory, forcing 5 to 10% price cuts. But nationally, the market is stalling at 0% growth. Sticker prices remain high, while wages grow slightly, creating a false affordability improvement. This plateau is the trap. It lures the final aspiring leaders into the market right before the real planetary trigger. The American public in 1836 was swimming in paper money, but the astrological ledger was screaming a different reality. By December of 1836, the cosmic trap was fully set. The nodal axis, the hands of the karmic clock that dictate fated systemic shifts, was positioned directly across the Taurus and Scorpio axis. These are the fixed signs of material wealth and, of course, debt. The transiting nodal axis was forming a grand cross to the natal nodal axis of the United States. At this exact moment of maximum market euphoria, transiting Jupiter, a planet of expansion and excess, was retrograding through Leo, right in the United States' 8th house of debt, which also rules other people's money, and it was directly conjuncting the nation's North Node. Jupiter on the North Node expanded the appetite for risk and took that desire for a grander, more wealthy future to an extreme. The public was leveraging debt to buy into the future. But while Jupiter inflated the top, the real silent killer was operating in the nation's 2nd house, the house of the nation's assets and the nation's wallet, so to speak. Transiting Neptune, the planet of illusion and confusion, which rules the US's 4th house of homes and land, was sitting exactly on the United States' South Node in the 2nd house. This is the ultimate signature of a financial phantom. The wealth that the public believed that they held was entirely illusory. The nation's assets were dissolved into Neptunian vapor. The paper money that they had just printed was backed by nothing. The smart money, the bankers, and the elite institutions who understand the cycles were quietly watching this pattern unfold, just waiting for the exact moment to pull the rug. Historically, the absolute peak of the 18-year cycle occurs when the last fool enters the market. In our current cycle, the 2026 softness is actually clearing the path for one final speculative peak, one final surge as rates hit this psychological 5.9%. If you sell right now, you are selling into a stall. But the astrological clock strikes midnight in the summer and the fall of 2026, because that is when Jupiter enters Leo. And when it conjuncts the North Node in summer of 2026, it very well could be that we are headed to the exact same blow-off top that had trapped the public in 1836. The top of the market is often a psychological state, whereas the turn of the market is definitely a physical event. In May of 1837, the localized American bubble collided violently with the global macroeconomic reality. The Bank of England, realizing that their gold reserves were becoming dangerously depleted by American speculation, aggressively raised interest rates. They began draining actual physical gold from the United States credit markets. Simultaneously, Andrew Jackson, knowing that the paper money system was a house of cards, issued the devastating Specie Circular. This executive order mandated that government land could no longer be purchased with wildcat paper. It had to be bought with physical gold and silver, or specie. The trap had sprung shut. The banks, forced to hand over their gold to London, had locked up their vaults. They suspended specie payments to the American public. You had paper money, but it was suddenly worthless. You couldn't buy land, you couldn't pay your debts, and you couldn't access hard capital. The credit market instantly froze. The Bank of England didn't just strike, it systematically pulled the oxygen out of the American credit market. The powers that be do not need to orchestrate the bubble. They control the contraction, and they deploy their agents to buy the blood. In May of 1837, the exact month that the panic fully fractured the economy, August Belmont arrived in New York. He was an agent of the Rothschilds, and he came over to process their claims and establish a dominant force in American finance. Today, in 2026, the specie return is the Fed pausing its cuts and locking in high rates. And the ultimate alarm bell is the yield curve, and specifically the yield curve's uninversion. The 10-year has crossed back above the 2-year. The liquidity trap is fully set for the 2027 downturn, where the affordability fracture completely disconnects asset prices from wages. Astrologically, the precision of this fracture is staggering. In May of 1837, transiting Jupiter had moved direct into Leo and was now sitting directly on top of the nation's North Node, forming a razor-sharp opposition to the transiting Neptune, which was sitting on the nation's South Node. Jupiter and Neptune opposing each other directly across the nodal axis of destiny is the violent severing of the dream. The Jupiterian excess of printed money slammed directly into the Neptunian reality of worthless paper. The illusion was shattered. To compound the panic, transiting Uranus, ruling sudden shocks and collapse, was semi-sextile to the South Node and in conjunct the North Node. The nodes were under immense erratic pressure. The old way of doing business in the United States housing market was being instantly eradicated, eliminated, and changed. And the panic had officially begun. And the similarities in 2026 with Jupiter conjunct the nation's North Node, opposed to Pluto this time, instead of Neptune, which will be conjunct the nation's South Node for the first time in over 200 years. This is creating the exact same type of razor-sharp opposing energy, and Pluto is set to cause a volcanic eruption in the United States housing market. Now, this is where the Taurus gets separated from the Titans. Amateurs believe that a real estate crash happens in a week. They look at the panic of 1837 and they assume that the market hit rock bottom the next day. But real estate is an illiquid, heavy asset. A housing crash is not a sudden drop. It is a grinding, agonizing, multiple-year bleed, which inevitably strips the middle class of their assets. The 4 to 6 year wait is mathematically the reality of how long it takes for bad debt to completely flush from an illiquid, heavily leveraged system. This 1825 to 1843 18-year cycle completely isolates the organic DNA of this pattern. It is a 12-year climb and a 6-year bleed, or it is a 14-year climb and a 4-year bleed. Whether it's a 12 and a 6 or a 14 and a 4, it's still 18. And in 2026, with a 14-year climb, we are looking at a 4-year drop. As the calendar moved forward from 1837, the heavy outer planets went to work, methodically dismantling the American economy year by year. In 1838, transiting Pluto was forming a harsh square to the United States sun. The core identity and authority of the nation was under severe pressure. Simultaneously, Saturn, the ruler of restriction and responsibility and hardships, it reached the 28th degree of Scorpio, while the transiting Pluto was opposed to the United States' natal Saturn. And the transiting Saturn was now sextile to the nation's natal Pluto, creating a double whammy effect. The banking system was already beginning to build the new, restrictive structure for how assets would be controlled moving forward. Saturn also began squaring the United States' moon. This was signaling a profound loss of basic comfort, along with a loss of security and a loss of stability for the everyday American. In 1839, transiting Saturn crossed the ascendant of the United States and entered the U.S.'s first house. This is a once-in-a-30-year transit of sheer, trying, and oppressive reality. The nation was forced to take on a harsh, restricted new identity. The banks were hoarding the gold, businesses were failing by the thousands. In Saturn's opposition to the United States' natal Uranus, the ruler of United States commerce, meant that the very mechanics of trade and survival were gridlocked. And the hoarding of gold is not a metaphor. It was a documented banking policy, as detailed by economist Murray Rothbard in his book, A History of Money and Banking in the United States. In October of 1839, the Bank of the United States of Pennsylvania officially initiated the second suspension of specie payments. The big banks flatly refused to redeem currency for gold. Because the banks locked the gold away, the total United States money supply experienced a cataclysmic contraction, falling from 240 million in 1839 down to 158 million by 1843. This was a devastating 34% drop. The air was intentionally let out of the balloon, and it starved the working class of liquidity. In 1840, the cosmos locked into a terrifying grand cross. Transiting Saturn formed an opposition to the United States' natal Mars, while simultaneously squaring transiting Uranus, which was opposing the United States' natal Neptune, the ruler of the 4th house of housing, Mars being the ruler of America's 5th house of investments. This configuration here is pure paralysis. The changes needed to happen. The bad debt needed to be flushed, but the system was caught in a brutal stalemate. The tension was tearing the public apart, and while Jupiter moved through Scorpio, it was exacerbating the banking elements that were feeding off of this decay. Between 1841 and 1842, Saturn moved into Capricorn, opposing the nation's Venus and Jupiter. The workforce was decimated, but here in the darkest part of the cycle, the planetary gears themselves began to signal an end. The transiting North and South nodes had completed their half return, which was signaling a much-needed faded shift in the tide. By 1842, Uranus moved into direct opposition with the nation's natal Neptune, which is the ruler of the United States' housing market. This was the ultimate, shocking realization of the bottom. The old foundation of American real estate was completely shattered. It was ready to be swept away, and Saturn, posing the United States' sun, was casting the final dark cloud over the entire nation as it prepared for capitulation. 6 grueling years after the credit market froze, the absolute floor was reached. By March 1st of 1843, the bad debt had been entirely flushed. Land in Chicago that had sold for $11,000 for a single acre was now being auctioned off for under $100, right as transiting Jupiter was conjunct the nation's south node. The wildcat banking system was systemically annihilated. According to the historical ledgers analyzed by the National Bureau of Economic Research, between 1837 and 1843, failures and massive loan losses reduced the total book assets of all state-chartered banks by a staggering 45%. Exactly 194 banks collapsed and were completely wiped from the ledger. The financial power was violently centralized, bringing it away from the frontier and back to the institutions in New York and London. The public was utterly exhausted, liquidated, and stripped of their leverage. And this is precisely when the apex predators stepped back into the light. The elite institutions, the big banks, the men who hoarded the specie, the bankers who had orchestrated the credit contraction. They unleashed their capital. They swept across the nation, buying up millions of acres of prime real estate, infrastructure, and other resources for literal pennies on the dollar. The slaughter reached the highest levels of government. According to historical records compiled in William English's Understanding the Cost of Sovereign Default, by 1842, 9 U.S. states and territories completely defaulted on their sovereign debt, unable to pay for the canals and the infrastructure that they had built during the huge boom. The United States government begged for loans in London, only to be told by James de Rothschild, you cannot borrow a dollar, not a dollar. With the states bankrupt and their bonds worthless, global banking houses like Barings and the Rothschilds deployed their banking agents to sweep up the state bonds, effectively taking ownership of American infrastructure, and doing so at rock bottom capitulation prices. The astrological chart for 1843 is the perfect blueprint of a market bottom and the laying of a new empire. The concrete is poured, with transiting Saturn in Capricorn, the architect of structure and control, forming a stabilizing, deeply supportive trine to the United States' natal Neptune. The violent squares and the oppositions of the earlier time period were gone. Saturn was laying the heavy, highly regulated concrete for the new housing cycle. With transiting Uranus sitting just 2 degrees away from crossing the United States' 4th house of homes and land and families, preparing to shock the market back into a new era of growth. Per usual, the trigger was delivered by the planet of kinetic action. Transiting Mars was preparing to cross the United States' natal ascendant, effectively firing the starting gun on the next great cycle of American expansion. Transiting Jupiter had reached its exact opposition with where it had started at the boom. It was now conjunct the United States' natal south node, the excess was gone, and the wealth had been fully transferred back to the foundational hidden ledgers of the elite. And this is the second half of the heartbeat. In 2030 and 2031, when Jupiter hits the north node, the market fractures. But exactly here, at the absolute floor in 1843, Jupiter was at the south node. In 2030 and 2031, because we have a 4-year drop, Jupiter will be exactly trine to the north node at 6 degrees Sagittarius, while conjuncting the transiting north node. We will probably see the floor when Jupiter reaches this point, this 120-degree trine to the natal north node. The elite will likely not buy the dip in 2027. They will buy the capitulation in 2030 and 2031, when Jupiter and the nodal axis give the signal. The banks had won again in 1843. They allowed the public to inflate the bubble. They pulled the liquidity when the cosmic clock had struck midnight, and they waited patiently while the market slid for 6 years and the middle class starved it out. And they went out and they bought up the entire board the exact moment that Saturn was set to stabilize the wreckage. We do not dissect the panic of 1837 for a history lesson. We dissect it because the 18 to 20 year real estate cycle is active source code of global finance. The assets change, but the planetary mechanics, the nodal returns, the Jupiter expansions are identical. The apex predators already know the math, and they are already moving their pieces. If you want to stop acting as liquidity for the institutions and start operating like the architect of your own empire. Here is your exact 3-step sovereign game plan for the next 4 years. Step 1, 2026. This is the great unloading. From summer through fall of 2026, Jupiter conjuncts the North Node in Leo, expanding the paper illusion to its absolute limit. The smart money is not buying real estate right now. They are building a massive war chest. If you own your home outright, or you are sitting on a comfortable, fixed 3% mortgage that you can easily service, then you are good. You already hold the fortress. But if you are holding over-leveraged investment properties, variable rate commercial debt, or speculative assets, then this is your exit window. Do not buy the peak. Use this final euphoric swell to liquidate bad debt and hoard your own specie, hard cash and liquid capital. Step 2, the 2027 turn. In the spring of 2027, and history proves there is always a 6 to 13 month lag between the market top and the physical turn. When Pluto crosses the South Node, the $1.8 trillion commercial debt wall will likely fracture, and the credit markets will likely freeze. The public will likely panic. The media will tell you to buy the dip, but I would not recommend catching falling knives. The high-level bankers know that real estate takes years to bleed out. Your only job during this 6 to 12 month turn is to violently protect your active income streams, adapt to the AI efficiency shifts that are happening in your own industry, or be a leader in your industry and get ahead of this. Try to keep your war chest out of the blast zone. Step 3, the 2030 to 2031 capitulation. This is the sovereign harvest, or it should be. The 4-year slide exhausts itself. Jupiter will be sextile to the South Node and forming a harmonious trine to the nation's natal North Node. Because this is a 14-year climb, and not a 12-year climb, we are expecting a 4-year fallout. The trine would be the best location for the market to bottom out, as the transiting North Node will have just crossed the ascendant, and the Sun and Jupiter will be conjunct the nation's ascendant within a few degrees. By then, the nation of renters will be fully established, and distressed properties will be sitting on the institutional ledgers. And this is the moment that I would predict that you should start to shift from preservation to aggression. You deploy the cash you hoarded in 2026 in order to buy the land, the infrastructure, and the hard assets for pennies on the dollar. You buy the capitulation, and you ride the next 18-year wave up from the ground floor. I will add one caveat here, and that is, in this particular cycle, Saturn and Uranus are in Gemini, and Saturn is set to enter Gemini. Last time Saturn entered Gemini, we had the dot-com crash. At other times when Saturn has entered Gemini, people have found their paper money to be worthless, or they have found that they can't use silver or they can't use gold. And Saturn will be entering Gemini in mid-2030, which means that you probably want to start to buy just a little bit before the full bottom, just in case that currency switches to some sort of CBDC or some sort of digital type of framework and you're not in on it. You don't want to get caught holding currency or liquid that isn't even usable. And that's the only way they can catch 22 you here. But you have the time map, the projected timeline. You've seen the evidence weighed against one of the prior cycles, and I've weighed the evidence against many, against multiple centuries. And this is just one of many that I'll be breaking down. So my advice, what I would do, is protect your capital, build your war chest, and prepare to execute when the cosmic clock strikes. Hit subscribe if you want to keep tracking this cycle with me. Check the links in the description below if you would actually like to work with me personally. Although I can only take on so many clients in a week or a month, as it's just me doing the analysis. It's just my skills. And so if you want to work with me, you want to jump on that now. I don't do low-level readings. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I do game plans, I do strategy, and I do it for you personally. And I hope this objective game plan helps you navigate the next 5 to 6 years.